Alexander Kane pretended to be blind? But why would one of the richest men in the world choose to live in darkness? The question haunted every whisper in the city's elite circles, though none dared to ask him directly. To the world, Alexander was a fragile man robbed of his sight in a tragic accident. But to himself, he was a hunter who had chosen the shadows to see what others thought he could not. In the silence of his study, hidden behind tinted glasses and a polished oak cane, Alexander listened more than he spoke. He had learned long ago that people reveal their true selves when they think no one is watching. And now, as he moved through his mansion blind, he could hear everything: the sighs, the lies, the betrayals tucked between footsteps and whispers. But why would a billionaire, who had the power to bend governments and markets to his will, willingly strip himself of sight? Why pretend to be helpless when he was anything but? And most importantly, what truth was he hunting so desperately that he would live every day as though trapped in endless night? Those were the questions no one asked aloud. But deep within Alexander's mind they repeated like a drumbeat. Why did she betray me? How deep does this deception go? What happens when the world finally learns the truth? It began months earlier, when Alexander first suspected the woman he loved most, his wife Elena, of betraying him. Elena was stunning, poised, and adored by society. She was the perfect wife, or so it seemed. But Alexander's instincts, sharpened by years of ruthless business wars, told him something darker lurked beneath her charm. One night, as she kissed his cheek goodnight, Alexander inhaled a faint trace of unfamiliar cologne. It wasn't his. His hands gripped the sheets as rage burned through him. But instead of confronting her, he smiled softly, murmured his goodnights and turned away, choosing silence over accusation. From that moment his plan began. He summoned a trusted physician to issue a discreet announcement. Alexander Kane had lost his sight permanently. The story spread like wildfire. Newspapers mourned the fall of a titan. Rivals whispered about his vulnerability, and Elena, oh Elena, reacted with the kind of compassion only a practiced actress could deliver. Yet behind the mask of blindness, Alexander watched her closely. He noted the tremor in her voice when she thought he couldn't see. He felt the distance in her embrace. He heard the late-night phone calls, the quick silences when he entered the room. And though the world saw him as a broken man, Alexander knew the truth. He was no victim. He was baiting the trap. Because in pretending to be blind he could finally open his eyes to everything. Alexander Kane had always believed that silence was more dangerous than noise. In silence, secrets grew like weeds, sprouting where no one thought to look. Now, living as a blind man in his own mansion, silence was his weapon. The mansion itself became a stage, its corridors echoing with voices that thought themselves private. Staff whispered, Elena laughed too sweetly on late-night calls, and footsteps crept across the marble floor long after midnight. Every sound was a confession. Every pause was evidence. Alexander mastered the art of listening. He counted the hesitant seconds in Elena's responses when someone asked where she had been. He measured the quick stutter in her tone when he mentioned loyalty or marriage. He heard doors closing softly, too softly, as though she was hiding her movements from a man who could not see. But Alexander could see even in darkness. Not with his eyes, but with the instincts that had built his empire. And what he saw shook him more than financial betrayal ever had. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Elena entered his study. Her heels clicked on the hardwood, precise and measured like a metronome of deceit. She spoke softly, her words laced with pity. Alexander, maybe you should rest more. You've been through so much. He smiled faintly beneath his glasses. Rest? No. He was more awake than ever. He reached for her hand, squeezing it as though he clung to her love. But he felt nothing in her touch. No warmth, no devotion, only the cool detachment of someone whose heart was elsewhere. Later that night, when the house had grown still, Alexander navigated the corridors alone, tapping his cane against the floor for effect though he no longer needed it. He paused outside Elena's private parlor. A sliver of light glowed beneath the door, and within it, the faint murmur of her voice. I told you, he believes it completely. He's helpless now. We just need more time. Alexander froze. The words stabbed like daggers, each syllable confirming what he already feared. Elena wasn't just unfaithful, she was conspiring. But with whom? And for what? Anger boiled in his chest, but he forced himself to remain silent. To burst in now would be to lose the game. Instead, he filed away every word, every intonation, like a general memorizing his enemy's strategy. As dawn crept over the horizon, Alexander sat in his study, the firelight reflecting in his glasses. He replayed her voice in his mind, dissecting it, searching for clues. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion, it was fact. But this betrayal was layered, deliberate, dangerous. And here lay the contrast. To the world he was the vulnerable billionaire, blinded by fate. But in truth he was the predator cloaked in weakness, biding his time. The mansion around him was no longer a home. It was a chessboard, and every person within its walls was a piece. Elena had made her move. Now it was Alexander's turn. Because sometimes, pretending to be powerless was the greatest power of all. Alexander Kane had built his empire by mastering two things: information and patience. In the boardroom these skills made him untouchable. But now in his own home they became his lifeline. Pretending to be blind gave him access to truths people would have hidden if they thought he could see. And the first truth was this: Elena wasn't working alone. It began with the voice. That same night when he overheard her whispering, another voice answered her. A man's voice, low and commanding but too muffled for him to place. Alexander leaned closer to the door, straining against the pounding in his chest. "We'll handle him," the man said. "He won't be a problem. Not anymore." Handle him? The words echoed like thunder in Alexander's skull. He realized with a cold shiver that this was more than an affair. This was a plot. His wife was entangled with someone who wanted him erased, not just from her life but from existence. The discovery sparked a storm within him. Alexander had faced rivals before, men who tried to strip him of his wealth, his power, his dignity. But never had betrayal walked into his bedroom, kissed his cheek and whispered good night. But Alexander did not react. He could not. To survive he needed to remain blind, at least in their eyes. The moment they suspected he knew the truth, he was finished. The following morning he gathered his loyal butler, Marcus, in the garden. Marcus had been with him for over 20 years. A man who had once served Alexander's father and was now more like family than staff. "Marcus," Alexander said softly, his sunglasses hiding his calculating stare, "tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in this house?" Marcus hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Yes, sir. Too many late visitors. Too many hushed calls. And, forgive me, but Mrs. Kane has grown careless. She's entertaining someone she shouldn't." The admission hit Alexander like a blade, even though he had already known. But Marcus wasn't finished. "I don't believe it's just an affair," Marcus continued. "I've seen papers, documents she shouldn't have. Company files, sir. Things only you or the board should access." Alexander's pulse quickened. Elena wasn't just betraying his love, she was reaching into the veins of his empire, siphoning what she could. But how much did she know? How deep had her betrayal run? As they spoke, Elena appeared at the balcony above them, smiling down sweetly as though nothing were wrong. "Darling, breakfast is ready," she called, her voice sugar-coated poison. Alexander lifted his face toward her, tilting his head like a helpless man grateful for her care. "Coming, my love," he replied warmly. But beneath that false warmth, he began to map his strategy. Elena thought she held the upper hand. She thought she was orchestrating his downfall. But Alexander Kane had not built a billion-dollar empire by being predictable. He would let her play her game. He would let her believe he was broken, blind, and helpless. But when the time came, the mask would fall, and the hunter would no longer pretend. Alexander Kane knew one truth: enemies often reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. And now, cloaked in the disguise of blindness, he had the perfect vantage point. His mansion, once a sanctuary of glass and marble, had become a stage for secrets, and he was the silent audience. That night, after Elena drifted into her carefully performed sleep beside him, Alexander lay still, his breathing slow and even. He had trained himself in the art of stillness during hostile takeovers, where patience could bleed a rival dry. Now that same discipline kept him alive. At 2 a.m. Elena slipped out of bed. He listened as her footsteps padded softly against the polished floor, her silk robe whispering in the dark. She paused at the door, glancing back at him. Alexander, eyes closed, let his lips part just enough to mimic a man lost in deep slumber. Satisfied, she left. Moments later he followed. Cane in hand, he moved silently, guided not just by memory but by the faint echoes in the massive hallways. He had memorized every creak, every corner of his estate. And tonight those details saved him. From the library he heard voices. Elena's, hushed but sharp, and another, the same man from before. Alexander stopped just shy of the doorway, heart hammering but steps steady. "You said he'd be gone by now," Elena snapped. "The accident should have finished him." "He's weaker," the man replied. Blind men don't last long in this world. Be patient. Alexander's blood ran cold. Accident? Was his wife admitting that the crash that nearly killed him hadn't been fate, but design? Suddenly the puzzle shifted. What if his blindness wasn't an accident at all? Elena's voice softened, dangerously intimate. Patience doesn't suit me. I want his fortune, his empire, his name, all of it. And when I have it, so will you. The man chuckled darkly. Soon, Elena. Very soon. Alexander stepped back, his grip on the cane tightening until his knuckles whitened. The truth was dawning like fire across his mind. The woman he loved was plotting not just betrayal but his elimination. And worse, she wasn't working alone. Retreating silently to his room, Alexander felt a storm building within him. But storms, he knew, destroyed indiscriminately. He couldn't just lash out, he had to control it, direct it, weaponize it. The next morning he began his counter-move. At breakfast, he leaned on his cane, playing the helpless role flawlessly. Elena, he said with a tender smile, I've been thinking. Since I can no longer handle business matters, perhaps you should take more control. Attend meetings, sign off documents. I trust you. Elena's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her perfectly composed face. Then she smiled too quickly. Of course, darling. Whatever helps ease your burden. But behind that smile, Alexander saw hunger. She believed she was winning. And that was exactly what he wanted. Because the more rope she took, the easier it would be to watch her hang herself with it. Alexander Kane had spent his life building empires by one principle. Information is power. And now, in the theater of betrayal that was his marriage, information was the weapon he needed most. But how could a blind man track a woman who thought she'd already won? By being underestimated. Elena, he realized, had grown careless. She thought darkness made him powerless. Instead, it gave him cover. He called Marcus his most trusted aide, a man who had served not just as a driver but as a loyal confidant for over 20 years. Marcus had been there before the billions, back when Alexander was clawing his way up from poverty. If there was one man he could trust, it was him. Follow her, Alexander whispered in his study, his voice low as if the marble walls themselves might betray him. Don't be seen. Don't be heard. And bring me back truth, not assumptions. Marcus nodded firmly. Consider it done, sir. That evening, Elena announced she was visiting at charity gala. She left the house draped in emerald silk, perfume lingering like poison in the air. Alexander, sitting in his armchair, tapped his cane slowly against the floor, smiling inwardly. Hours later Marcus returned. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed with the weight of what he carried. He placed a small recorder and a set of photos on Alexander's desk. Alexander's hands, though steady, felt heavier than steel as he touched the photos. The first revealed Elena in a private booth at a dimly lit lounge. The second showed her leaning across the table, lips almost brushing the man opposite her. But it was the third photo that froze Alexander's heart. The man wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just anyone. He was Victor Kane, Alexander's estranged younger brother. For years, Victor had lived in Alexander's shadow, consumed by envy. Where Alexander had built, Victor had squandered. Where Alexander had earned loyalty, Victor had burned bridges. Their last encounter ended with Victor cursing his name, vowing that one day the empire would be his. Now the pieces clicked into place. Elena hadn't just betrayed him with another man, she had betrayed him with his own blood. Marcus's voice was grim. I followed them after. They weren't just whispering sweet words. They were plotting. She spoke of transferring assets. He promised her power. And together, they laughed about you. Alexander leaned back, his face expressionless, but his mind burned with fury. Betrayal from a wife was one wound. Betrayal from a brother was another. But the two together? That was an assassination of the soul. Still, Alexander didn't rage. He didn't cry. Instead, he breathed deeply, eyes narrowing. Good, he murmured. Now I know my enemies. And they think I'm blind. But Marcus, soon the blind man will see more than anyone. That night, as Elena returned and slipped into bed, Alexander lay beside her in silence. She thought he was broken, dependent, and in the dark. But in truth, he was wide awake, planning a game of shadows where only one side would walk away unscathed. The following morning, Alexander Kane sat at the breakfast table, his cane resting against the polished oak chair. Elena poured him coffee, her movements graceful, her smile rehearsed. To anyone else she looked like the perfect wife. But Alexander now saw her every gesture as a mask, one she wore while plotting with his brother behind his back. He lifted the cup to his lips and let her believe he was helpless. "Elena," he said softly, "thank you for taking such good care of me. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her hand froze for the briefest moment before she forced a smile. "You'll always have me, darling. Always." But Alexander knew her always belonged to Victor. That day he called Marcus into his private study. The room smelled faintly of leather and aged whiskey. Shelves of books towered over them, silent witnesses to the war Alexander was about to wage. "They think I'm blind," Alexander began, "but blindness has given me an advantage. They underestimate me. And that will be their undoing." Marcus leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Alexander tapped his fingers against the desk. "First we let them dig their own graves. I want proof, financial records, recordings, movements. If Victor and Elena are planning to siphon my empire, we'll let them make the first move. But when they strike, the trap will close." He outlined his scheme. Hidden cameras disguised in the corners of his study, voice recorders placed inside Elena's handbag by a discreet maid, and Marcus shadowing Victor's every step. "But sir," Marcus warned, "if they suspect you're not blind, the game is over." Alexander's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then we play our parts perfectly. I'll be the blind billionaire, vulnerable and naive. And when the mask comes off, it will be their downfall." That evening, Alexander sat in his study, appearing lost in thought. Elena entered, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low tone. She paused when she noticed him. "Who were you speaking to?" Alexander asked, his tone innocent. "Just a friend," she replied quickly, placing the phone on the desk. Alexander reached for it, fumbling slightly as though his blindness left him clumsy. "Mind if I call Marcus? I've been meaning to ask him something." Elena hesitated before handing him the phone. What she didn't know was that Alexander had already instructed Marcus to call at that very moment. The phone rang seconds later, Marcus's number glowing on the screen. Alexander smiled inwardly. She hadn't deleted Victor's name from her call logs. Proof number 1. Later that night, Alexander whispered to himself as he lay in bed, Elena asleep beside him. "Every betrayal leaves a trail, and I will follow it to the end." Unbeknownst to Elena, the cameras were already rolling, the recorders already listening. The empire she thought she was stealing was, in fact, tightening its noose around her. The blind man was watching. Victor Kane leaned back in the dimly lit corner of a luxurious penthouse suite overlooking the city. A glass of expensive brandy swirled lazily in his hand, but his mind was restless. Across from him, Elena sat perched on the edge of the sofa, her silk dress shimmering under the chandelier. "You said he was finished, Victor?" Elena whispered, glancing nervously toward the door as though Alexander might burst in at any moment. "You promised he'd never find out." Victor smirked, sipping his drink. "Relax. The old fool is blind, Elena. He couldn't find his way out of a hallway without your help. He doesn't suspect a thing." Elena bit her lip, but unease clouded her eyes. "Sometimes, it feels like he's watching me. Even when I'm sure he can't." Victor chuckled darkly. "That's guilt talking. You've lived too long in his shadow, playing the dutiful wife. But soon all of this," he gestured to the glittering skyline, "will be ours. The company, the wealth, the legacy. We'll take everything from him, and by the time he realizes, it'll be too late." What neither of them noticed was the tiny recording device hidden inside Elena's purse, quietly capturing every word. Meanwhile, back at the Kane estate, Alexander sat in his study with Marcus, listening to the live feed through a discreet earpiece. The sound of Elena's voice cut through him like a knife, but he didn't flinch. "So it's true," Marcus muttered, anger flashing in his eyes. "They're plotting to strip you of everything." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Not strip, steal. And theft demands justice." He paused the recording and sat back, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Let them believe they're winning. The more confident they grow, the more reckless they'll become. And that's when we strike." The next morning, Elena slipped back into her role as the caring wife. She helped Alexander down the stairs, adjusted his tie, and even kissed his cheek with practiced tenderness. But Alexander, behind his dark glasses, saw through it all. "Elena," he murmured, "you've been going out a lot lately. Is everything all right?" She froze for a heartbeat before composing herself. "Just charity events, meetings with friends. You wouldn't want me locked up here, would you?" Alexander smiled faintly. "Of course not. I'd never want to cage a free spirit." But inside, his mind was sharpening like a blade. Later that evening, Alexander deliberately staged a stumble, nearly crashing into a vase in the hallway. Elena rushed to steady him, her face etched with concern. But Alexander noticed the flicker in her eyes, the annoyance, the subtle impatience at his weakness. It was all the confirmation he needed. The woman at his side was no longer his wife but his enemy. As he retired to bed, Elena whispered a false good night. And Alexander whispered back in his mind, the night will soon end. And when the sun rises, betrayal will burn. The blind man's revenge was no longer just a plan, it was a storm-gathering force. The following week, the Kane estate buzzed with unusual activity. Contractors came and went, claiming to be working on safety renovations for Alexander's blindness, installing new security systems, widening hallways, replacing fragile decor with reinforced furniture. Elena assumed it was Marcus's doing, fussing over Alexander's condition. She barely questioned it. But behind the polished smiles of the workers lay Alexander's silent army of loyalty, hand-picked staff who owed their lives and livelihoods to him. Every wire they ran, every camera they placed, every sensor they installed was not for his blindness, but for his trap. At breakfast one morning, Elena sipped her orange juice absent-mindedly as Alexander poked at his food with deliberate clumsiness. She had grown used to his slow movements, his missteps, his vacant gaze. "You've been working too hard," Elena murmured, her voice dripping with practiced affection. "Maybe you should think about stepping back from the company. Let Victor help with the board until you're ready again." Alexander tilted his head slightly as though considering it. "Victor?" he asked with a faint smile. "You trust him that much?" Her smile flickered. "Of course. He's always been family." Alexander chuckled softly, his face unreadable behind the dark glasses. "Family?" The word tasted bitter. That afternoon, Elena slipped away for another charity meeting, but Alexander already knew where she was going. The newly installed trackers on her car told him everything. She met Victor in a quiet downtown restaurant, whispering heatedly over wine. Through the hidden earpiece Marcus had set up, Alexander listened. "We need to move faster," Victor pressed, his voice low. "The board's restless. If Alexander keeps clinging to power, it'll be harder to push him out." Elena leaned closer. "He's slipping. You saw how he fumbled yesterday. He's weak, blind, dependent. Soon the shareholders will beg for someone stronger." Victor smirked. "And that someone will be me. With you at my side." Alexander sat silently in his study, hands folded in his lap. His breathing was calm, steady, controlled. But beneath that calm burned a storm. When Elena returned home that night, she found Alexander seated in the darkened library, his face lit faintly by the glow of the fireplace. "You're late," he said quietly. She startled, clutching her purse tighter. "I told you charity work runs long." Alexander tilted his head, as though listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a faint smile, he said, "Charity is a noble thing, Elena. But some charities take more than they give." Her pulse quickened. For a fleeting second she wondered if he knew. But when he stood and fumbled toward the stairs, appearing every bit the helpless blind man, her fears eased. She didn't realize that every word, every lie, every whisper she shared with Victor was already being catalogued, recorded, and prepared for the perfect unveiling. Alexander wasn't rushing his revenge. He was building it brick by brick like a fortress. And soon Elena and Victor would find themselves trapped inside with no escape. The Kane estate glimmered under the golden glow of chandeliers as staff hurried to prepare for an upcoming charity gala. It was an event Elena herself had insisted upon, an opportunity to show strength to society despite Alexander's blindness. She saw it as a stage for her own charm and for Victor's subtle rise in influence. What she didn't realize was that the gala would become the theater of her undoing. Alexander sat quietly in his study that morning, his fingers tracing the edges of a heavy envelope on his desk. Inside were files, photos, voice recordings, all the evidence Marcus had collected. Every betrayal was documented, every whispered plan immortalized. He could have confronted them in private, exposed their lies behind closed doors, but that was not justice. Justice, Alexander knew, had to be seen. Marcus entered silently, bowing his head. "Everything is ready. The board members will be in attendance and the projector is tested." "Are you certain about this, sir? Once the truth comes out, it won't just ruin them. It could shake the entire company." Alexander smiled faintly, though his eyes remained fixed in that distant, unfocused way. "Some storms are necessary, Marcus. You don't cleanse a house by ignoring the rot, you burn it out." That evening, Elena descended the grand staircase in a glittering emerald gown, dazzling the arriving guests. She kissed Alexander's cheek softly, her perfume sharp and sweet. Just smile, darling, she whispered. Let them see you're strong even if you can't see them. Alexander nodded, allowing her to lead him into the ballroom. Applause rose as the billionaire entered, the world pitying his misfortune yet admiring his resilience. Elena basked in the glow, her hand never straying far from Victor, who mingled with board members at her side. As the evening progressed, Alexander played his role flawlessly, nodding politely, stumbling slightly, smiling vacantly. But beneath that mask, his mind was razor-sharp, tracking every whisper, every look, every calculated gesture between Elena and Victor. At last the moment arrived. The host called for Alexander to give a short speech, a tradition at Kane Foundation events. Elena leaned close, whispering, "Keep it simple, love. They don't expect much." But Alexander rose slowly, gripping the podium with steady hands. The ballroom hushed. "My friends," he began, his voice calm, even tender, "tonight we gather not only to give, but to reflect. They say blindness robs you of the world. But sometimes losing your sight allows you to see more clearly than ever before." A ripple of curiosity passed through the crowd. Elena shifted uneasily. Victor frowned. Alexander continued, his tone sharpening ever so slightly. "I have learned that darkness doesn't only live outside us. Sometimes, it lives in the very hearts of those closest to us. And tonight, I want to share with you what I have discovered." With that, he tapped the podium lightly. The massive projector behind him flickered to life. Elena's blood ran cold. Victor stiffened. The storm had arrived. The ballroom was silent except for the faint hum of the projector as the first image appeared on the massive screen. At first it was innocent enough, a photo of Alexander and Elena from years past, smiling together at a gala much like this one. The guests murmured politely. Then the images shifted, grainy security footage, Elena slipping into a luxury hotel suite. Another frame, Victor entering the same room minutes later. Then stills of their hands brushing too long, their lips meeting in shadow. Gasps rippled across the hall. Murmurs rose like a wave and all eyes turned to Elena. Her face drained of color, her perfect composure crumbling. "Alexander, this is a trick," she stammered, stepping toward him. "They're lying to you. Don't believe this." But her words died as the next slide appeared, audio recordings. Her voice filled the ballroom, sharp and venomous. "Do you think he'll ever realize? The blind fool doesn't even know what's happening in his own house." Laughter, hers and Victor's, echoed through the speakers. The room erupted in chaos. Guests whispered, cameras flashed, board members exchanged horrified glances. Victor stepped forward, his usual smirk gone. "Enough," he barked, turning to Alexander. "You think this makes you powerful? You're nothing without me. Without us. You can't even see." Alexander turned his head slightly, his clouded eyes fixed in Victor's direction. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed his tinted glasses. The crowd gasped. His gaze, though calm, was piercing. "Sure. Clear." "I can see, Victor," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "I've always been able to see." The blindness was an act, to reveal the truth. The room fell deathly silent. Elena staggered backward, horror etched into her face. The pity she had thrived on, the control she wielded, it crumbled to dust in a single revelation. Alexander turned to the crowd. "This company, this family, this legacy, I built it with trust. And tonight, you've all witnessed what betrayal does when it is left unchecked. Let this not only be about me, but about all of us. Sometimes we must lose everything, our pride, our illusions, to see what truly matters." The audience erupted into applause, though hushed with disbelief. Some clapped out of respect, others out of shock. Elena collapsed into a chair, weeping silently. Victor stormed out, his empire in ashes. But just as Alexander was about to leave the stage, Marcus approached with a final envelope. He whispered, "Sir, you need to see this." Alexander hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a photograph, not of Elena and Victor, but of his own late father with a woman who was not his mother. A decades-old affair. A family secret. For a moment Alexander froze. His father, the man he idolized, had been no different from Elena. The betrayal was not new, it was inherited. He looked out at the crowd again, his voice trembling for the first time. "Perhaps," he said softly, "the blindness was never mine alone. Perhaps, it runs in all of us." The guests whispered in shock. The story they thought had ended, had only deepened. The screen went black. The truth lingered, heavier than ever. What Alexander discovered changed everything, But what's coming next will leave you speechless. Subscribe today so you don't miss the next shocking story.